to it. All right, well, we're being recorded. I think that's probably fine. Nick, I'll start with Nick. Nick is the founder and chairman of the Climate Bonds, director of Radix and Big Tent Ideas Festival, and the chairman of Callan Consulting. He's a visiting fellow at Bayes Business School at City University, where he teaches the emerging global risks course. He's worked with the UN, the World Bank, 30 countries' governments on climate change and economic development. Nick recently won the President's Award for his outstanding contribution to the actuarial profession and the FIATUS Award for his charitable efforts. And Nick's book, Finance, Society, and Sustainability, was recently published by Paul Grave Macmillan, and Nick is a freeman of the City of London. Nico is the incoming CIO of Connected Asset Management, DC pensions and investment sector, most recently and still currently CIO of the People's Pension. He's been a volunteer for the IFWA for many years with roles on council, chairing the Sustainability Board, which was then called the Resource and Environment Board, literature review into sustainability and the financial system. Today, Nico is going to talk about what it means to be sustainable. And I had a peek at the slides. I'm not going to spoil anything. I think it'll be quite an interesting discussion. I will only say that you can only do things differently if you can think differently. I think today will help us. Right? Things differently, man. Doing things, distinguishing yourself in your offering. I think with the systemic and existential problems we face today, doing things differently now means doing things differently from how you yourself used. Without any further ado, Nico, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Morning, everyone. If you hear me being a little hoarse, then I can confirm I've got a very normal cold. No, it's not a COVID, yeah, so I'll hopefully be able to talk with my voice lasting. I have some slides, as Sam has said. They are very sparse, right? So this is intended to be, I think, it's a bit of a ramble through some thinking that I've been doing on sustainability. Really, I think trying to grapple with what we can call sustainable. We have, let me just do that. Can everyone see that full screen? Does that work? Yeah, great. So I think it's really tempting for us to want to find, I'm an investor, a sustainable fund. And the sustainable fund is full of sustainable stuff. And so we can have, a portfolio of sustainable stuff, which means that, everything in it be sustainable. And so what is that thing that are sustainable? I generally have to start by reminding people that I study theoretical physics. So I come at quite a different approach to, someone from the humanities. I think to quote Fight Club, on a long enough timeline, the survival probability for anything goes to zero, right? So how can you have something, but we understand it not to last? So what does that word sustainable mean? So I've been kind of thinking about this and trying to work out if there's anything sensible that we can do, or anything a bit sort of nebulous and marketing to use the word sustainable. And I'm not sure I've come to any conclusions on that. But what I wanted to do is kind of present a bit more of really views of nature and backdrop for our actions looks like, because it's really important we understand that a bit more, so that we can start to think about how we go about determining what sustainability is. And this is very much a systems thinking process. Okay, so on this first slide, I guess if you go back to a sort of Christian Bible view and think about the Garden of Eden, then, you know, in 7 days, 6 days, a universe was created which was perfect. And from that moment on, that perfection was just assumed to be static. But that's a sort of static nature. A lot of religions will have that kind of creation myth. It's weird that we can persist in that and have history where we can see things change. That's because of the corrupting influence of man over nature. So you get this sort of dichotomy between nature, this static thing full of wonderful organisms and beauty, and man, this kind of goes and destroys that. But you can, and you think about, well, you know, the sort of complexity of civilization, life, the atmosphere, stars. You can build up that complexity picture with as many sort of layers as you want. Then, you know, there's this sense in some ways that we talk about sustainability and what is sustainable, that in some ways we're trying to not disrupt a thing, that there is a perfect system which is fixed, and either we want our actions not to disrupt that, or very possibly we want our actions to take us back to that Garden of Eden, right? So we want to remove man's influence. We want to encourage, you know, close to extinct, endangered animals to recover their populations. Sort of word of what is sustainable is sort of like basically anything that's not human is what is sustainable. Here at the bottom, you know, a comment about maths. You know, a fixed universe has probability distributions. A fixed universe is describable because it doesn't change. So the beautiful world of functional maths, where, you know, we can describe with equations how things are set up, works, and that is a tenable strategy. So, you know, that is probably, I think, you know, I haven't put pictures on here, right? So we probably describe this with, you know, lots of beautiful pictures of nature and you know, the kind of untrammeled landscapes. But this is probably the kind of popular conception of nature that we're talking about when we think about sustainability. But, and this is where I become a physicist, you know, thermodynamics suggests that everything decays. Okay, so, you know, if you set something to have a structure, you're essentially creating free energy. And what happens over time is that the universe wants equilibrium, and it doesn't really want you to have free energy. So what the universe will do over time, and potentially very long time, is to go and erode your free energy. And so any kind of static world that you kind of have a picture of, a snapshot of now, is doomed to decay over, that could be lifetimes, it could be, you know, until the heat death of the universe, the sort of ultimate out there kind of future point in time. And one of the things that I've been kind of chasing up thermodynamics, having dropped it for 15 years, one of the things that I've kind of discovered in my reading is that actually kind of modern thermodynamics moved out of physics into, first of all, chemistry, and there's a couple of chemists who won Nobel Prize, really how reactions and change processes work within a thermodynamic world, and is now really, it's kind of gone into an ecological discipline. It's still quite niche, right? So it's still quite theoretical in both of those sciences. But what modern thermodynamicists are talking about is that essentially, yes, the universe wants to erode free energy. It wants to get to this equilibrium. And to do that, what it does is create structure. So emergence of structure is a result of the second law of thermodynamics asks everything to decay into equilibrium. So you can look at things like convection cells as water comes to a boil. Those convection cells, hugely organized structures of billions of billions of billions of billions of billions of molecules, spontaneously arise because that helps to dissipate the free energy of the heat at the bottom of the pan. Structuring itself, organizing itself to speed up the approach of the heat death of the universe, of the approach of equilibrium. So you can see all structure comes from this kind of thermodynamics. And I'll put the Big Bang on the left and the end of the universe on the right at one of my points. But that action out of this raw free energy of the Big Bang, which contained no structure and lots of free energy, is written at the beginning of time. Maybe if you take an atheistic or kind of a nuanced approach to some of the text. Okay, so that kind of universal process of creating structure, this is somewhere between a kind of schematic and an actual kind of process diagram. You need to have any kind of living process, so something that kind of uses. You need, everything is physical, so you need a source of materials. You then have a sort of body process, which in some ways is cyclical. So very often it needs its structure to be kind of alongside that energy, and that could be a tornado, where the structure is a sort of design to take the pressure differences from the ground up into the atmosphere and vice versa, or it could be thinking about how the population kind of renews itself through birth and death, and you need your wastes. And so this is how structure is created to disperse more rapidly free energy, right? So without this structure, the source flowing into the sink is what would happen over time. The creation of this structure makes that energy source flow into the sink much quicker. So on the right, this tornado, that pressure difference that is created by the hot air and the sun in the summer in Tornado Alley will disperse over into the low pressure over time. But, the nature wants it to happen quicker. There's enough energy difference there and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of molecules spontaneously kind of align into a funnel, and they funnel to difference, erode the temperature gradient and pressure gradients, and unleash huge destructive forces at the same time. And there's a sort of beauty to this, right? So these structure, maybe it's my madness, but I start to see them everywhere, and I would see these things as being like the kind of tool, the kind of the granularity of living systems. So as I say, the ecosystem would be built up of this. I've talked previously about how information flows in this cycle, that information is the thing that enables structure to be kind of repeated, and therefore kind of human society would build up of this. So that's a growing thing, right? So you can start a tiny structure across that, and it's like sort of connecting a circuit. All of this flows through, and as a result, it's going to grow. And over, in our friends in ecology, they have an equation to the growth, the Verhulst equation, This is essentially well, a differential equation which looks to describe how the population P, and it uses two parameters. So R, which is a growth rate, and K, which is a carrying capacity. You can think of this to say, well, what is the size of the population that you need to kind of try and source into the sink at a sustainable level, assuming that that source is itself being replenished. And if you start with 1 or 2, how quickly will you grow into that? So just looking at the carrying capacity first, you can see that if you vary the carrying capacity, but K here, but keep R static, what happens? The general shape of the curve is an asymptotic growth. But over here on the left of the curve, you can see that all the lines look the same. So when you have exponential growth at the beginning, you can't tell what your destination is. So exponential growth, compound interest, these are all things that very naturally would look the same regardless of your destination when you are small in relation to your carrying capacity. So when you have a small share in relation to that energy difference, temperature difference, then you're going to grow exponentially quickly. But as you approach the carrying capacity, your growth is going to start so this naturally starts to kind of hint at whether growth is a sustainable part of the solutions that we should be looking at. Obviously, a lot of those people who are talking about sustainability and sustainability investment are believing in growth at the same time. Just to reflect of the Verhulst equation. So as you change the rate of growth, and here keeping the carrying capacity stationary, you can see that what happens is that you sort of extend the length of time that you take to carrying capacity. And on the left-hand side, with the yellow line, you get a very sharp run up to the kind of limits that this ecosystem has, and progressively slower and kind of more time in that kind of exponential growth phase. Now, I don't think any ecologist that the Verhulst equation is applies. It's a sort of model equation of what happens in perfect terms, and again, as a physicist, I would be perfectly damped oscillator. Here is that the population overshoots its carrying capacity and therefore has to crash. This is a population that in some way actually knows how many of the species should be out there to perfectly fulfill its niche in the ecosystem, and either through well-timed deaths or reductions in fertility is actually tailing off its growth at the carrying capacity. In practice, you would potentially expect either a species not to approach its carrying capacity because other things get in the way, like other species predating on it, or indeed you might expect a species to overshoot its carrying capacity for the lines here to come above 10,000, which I marked as the carrying capacity, and then sort of oscillate back down to that level. But the ecologists have an equation for growth which is non-infinite, right? So the ecologists have the right-hand side of what we have. We have the solution for compound interest on the left, and up it goes without stopping. The ecologists understand that that's the young phase of growth. So again, is growth part of what is sustainable? Well, thinking about how ecosystems kind of form, so I'll take that example of a tornado, but obviously a tornado does that children. But you could see that potentially there's an energy source which is kind of diffused by a structure, one of these kind of universal processes. You know, how does the ecosystem add complexity? Well, potentially first, something else can just steal that energy source. And you know, you get a kind of sharing of a source of energy. Secondly, you know, that organism, that body contains energy. So, you know, obviously organisms get eaten, but, you know, that tornado itself has a mass which you could harness, and you know, you can think of a water wheel being a rotation mass, and you can just go and steal that body. And of course, the thing that energy systems, ecosystems most love to do is to see that the wastes are not that well, you know, the energy is still a bit left in the wastes. So you can go and, you know, eat the wastes if you can kind of harness a bit more out of it. So you get these kind of three modes of introducing more complexity into ecosystems. And again, it will do. So, you know, as time goes on, if there is over, then complex structure will emerge to go and do these things and make the more complex. So it is natural that we would expect sort of complexity to increase over time through the kind of I eat your lunch, you are your waste kind of process. This is the chart I kind of promised earlier. And you can sort of think about these sort of three phases of the universe, right? You have phase, which I think we're probably still in, where, you know, from this very simple matter and energy released at the Big Bang, a huge amount of complexity was built up, right? So you can see a star as being a process of pulling together atomic nuclei, heavier and more complex atoms, and within the star there will be huge numbers of current together the helium, pull together the kind of hydrogen fuels, and store in different ways. You can think of the atmosphere, which, you know, on a lucky few number of planets, is able to be heated by their star, is able to cycle that energy around the planet. You can think of life, which is able to harness chemistry, potentially to harness the energy of that star, potentially to harness chemical processes of reduction and oxidation happening around kind of geothermal vents. You can think of civilization, which is kind of built around written and oral languages and the interactions of groups. And you can think of another phase, which we haven't seen yet, or maybe yet, which is another level of emergent complexity which could arise. So in this kind of creative phase of the universe, more and more complexity is kind of being built up. So, you know, again, at a level of sustainability, if we want a static universe, then are we kind of calling time on this creative phase? Are we sort of pushing a line down on the left-hand side this far and no further? We then get into some sort of maintenance phase where, you know, it's not us that's maintaining, it is the fact that there's still energy sources which enable stars still to burn, it enables the atmosphere still to turn over and life to live. Again, from a sustainability perspective, you know, there's a sort of hubris here, right? Can we sustain energy sources, able to keep things going, you know, by sort of will of words, or is there just sort of fundamental kind of physics? A destructive phase, and one by one, the kind of highest order of these processes, and you know, at a certain point in time, there won't be the energy source for us to run. We'll leave behind relics of old buildings and you know, our texts, and then there won't be the energy to run life. You know, the star will be at lower power, and you know, photosynthesis won't work, and life will be switched off, and it leaves behind its relics of kind of fossils. And you know, maybe the atmosphere will be switched off, and then the stars themselves, billions, trillions, quadrillions, unnamed words of lengths of time, destructive phase, where the energy source given to us at the beginning of time with the Big Bang is kind of slowly switched off. So, you know, this is the question, I think, let's say a label of sustainable, a label where something that I can call a thing sustainable and suggest that it will be sustained. We have to have choices around by sustainability, because nature is evolving, right? We don't know whether there's more complexity to come, or whether we are just the tip, that kind of point where we're at maximum complexity and it's sort of down. And it also means that, you know, a sort of static view of the, therefore a static maths isn't that helpful. I put mostly harmless, which was the Douglas side of description in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy of Earth, right? So, you know, it's okay that we have strongly designed equations which treat you know, the universe as being, but you know, they don't describe the universe. They are models that enable us to think about the universe, but you know, are not the same as the universe. So the question really becomes, I guess, that first chart I showed, you know, is a kind of stretch out, right? A time horizon which is much, much shorter. This is a sort of infinite time horizon. What if we stretch that out, then we get to a sort of static seeming universe, right? Static seeming universe is still building up, right? So we still believe that evolution happens, that, you know, succession, which is essentially that if I kind of clean the slate of a piece of land, that organisms will come and reinvade it, and over time I'll get back to a kind of forest over thousands of years. Those processes are still demonstrating that the universe is not static, right? They're still evolving in the broad sense of the word. So can I in any way kind of pull that time frame far enough apart so that I have something to use that kind of static worldview at, and kind of talk about what is sustainable with a static worldview? It would be very convenient if we could, right? And as I say, I think that is how it is done in the sort of common parlance. But for me, that just feels kind of, maybe not flawed, but limited. It feels limited. And it feels like there's a lot of sort of unearthed, unaired kind of discussion. So there's a lot of subjectivity in how we think about sustainability, right? I've framed this around trying to think about, you know, what we want to keep, right? And, you know, subjectively, we probably want to keep the pretty animals. But, you know, COVID-19 is a part of creation, right? So if we want to be truly kind of hands-off, static naturists, accept that nature is going to throw viruses at us. It's going to throw viruses at the organisms we're trying to keep. So when we try and think about what the preservation of nature looks like in our sustainability world, we have to sort of pull out of ourselves the sort of pretty nature. We're great at trying to think about, you know, the kind of poster child organisms, but, you know, can we really divide that? There's also then what we want to prevent from happening, right? And so we want to allow is presumably this increasing complexity, right? There's a sort of inexorability to it. So, you know, there's a sort of value judgment there as well. So these are all questions, right? Do we want to prevent, you know, can we? Over the longest period of time, you know, we know that the life will end and the stars will go out. So are we just trying to kind of lengthen those timelines? You know, in the next 10 million years, tectonic plates will move all of the geography and mean that the organisms that live there now can't be sustained, right? There's a great example that I heard, which is that, you know, 5 million years ago, the Everglades of Florida were underwater. And 5 million years before that, they were essentially a savanna that lions lived on. So when you come as an ecologist, when you come as someone who thinks about, you know, how powerful are you? Right? What is, and how much kind of prevention of stuff are you actually able to do? So lots and lots of value judgments. And of course, probably the biggest one is like, who gets to decide this, right? Is this something that we elect people to be in power to decide, and there's sort of one answer for everyone? Is this something that we all individually decide, and maybe our answers all clash? What is the power allocation process for whatever kind of subjective process, subjective kind of thinking that we need to do around sustainability? So this is a huge, huge kind of complex, nuanced problem set that we just can't put a label on, right? We can't say, hey, this is sustainable and this is not sustainable. Wrapped into that is who is talking about what they think sustainability means and how they came to that. It's a really, really deeply complex thing, which isn't to say that you need to expose all of your working, but it is to say that let's brush that under the carpet because, you know, you're going to be wrong. And then I kind of framed relativity, you know, if you come up with these kind of positions of this is what we would like to see as sustainable, then you do need some models, right? You do need to have some kind of view as to what is happening to try and prove or disprove that some action is kind of sustainable, right? And that was the kind of final thought that I wanted to come on to, was that kind of prove or disprove of sustainable. So Popper, the kind of theoretical theory of scientists, philosophy of scientists, talked about kind of falsifiability. So I believe the quote is that science doesn't progress by proving its ideas, but disproving the old ones, right? So the point being that the theories that we hold in science are not ones that are right, but ones that we have most struggled to falsify. And as we can design more and more kind of expensive and invasive tests, then we can kind of falsify, disprove the current theories and challenge the theoreticists to come up with more and more complex and harder to disprove theories. And this is how we progress towards understanding reality, by disproving things. So this is falsifiability. And I was struck by thinking about sustainability as a sort of falsifiable thing. So that means we can't put a pin on something which says sustainable, but we can put a pin on something which says, so we can say against our value judgments, we expect this thing to destroy, reduce complexity, to over whatever time frame we have chosen. So we can have some sort of a test to say, carbon dioxide, being emitted into the air is not a sustainable thing. And this reminded me of the kind of indicator functions in group theory, which is really just a function which says, true if this is part of your group, and false if it is not part of your group. So you get this kind of series of different indicator functions trying to explore, like Swiss cheese, the kind of landable actions, trying to identify not what is sustainable, but what is unsustainable. And what is left behind is essentially the kind of yet to be negated series of actions which we currently consider to be unsustainable. Right? And again, this is sort of deeply dissatisfying for anyone who wants a simple label to stick onto like an investment product, but is deep down what we're thinking about. And I was talking about, I think to Nick in preparation for this, chlorofluorocarbon. So if you go back to the invention of the fridges, before that, before refrigeration, the coming along of something which enabled your food to last longer at home, hugely sustainable. What an amazing thing that we didn't have to waste milk and meat, and all of these fantastic longer lasting of food has meant less wastage, right? Greater production, because you can have distances for transportation. That's what chlorofluorocarbons enabled. Fast forward another 30, 40, 50 years, and we discover that actually there's another indicator function we should be having for unsustainable, and that's looking at the ozone layer. So, our progress through technology has to be nuanced, right? We know that when we label something now as being not yet proven to be unsustainable, that it may at some point be proven in future to be unsustainable. And that's just all knowledge. At the same time, the system itself is changing, right? So what you thought to be a good test previously may well have had the system kind of shift underneath you. So you thought it was great to have deer in Scotland, right? Well, hey, that's fine when you've got 3,000 deer, right? That's fantastic. It's a beautiful thing to have. But all of a sudden, deer are really destructive, right? The system underneath you has changed. And now you're in a world of having to kill deer to make the system more sustainable. So you have this sort of unsustainability in a shifting landscape, right? And that kind of complexity is really what we have to kind of grapple with when we think about sustainability, right? This kind of complex system which is building up over time, this kind of worldview of humans. So how do we kind of come together and think about sustainable? So, maybe I overthink things, right? But I just dislike that kind of, here is a label that I can put on and say this is sustainable and this is not, right? First pass, right? I'm a great supporter of the EU taxonomy, and that really gets fund managers and companies thinking about what companies do. But in 5 or 10 years' time, everything that is now marked as green will be in a different place, right? And it could be too green, and we could have done more, or probably more likely it will be the kind of amber. And we'll be concerned about some of the things that those products do, unless they have a process to keep on kind of going through this, right? So there has to be some sort of airing of the view of an institution to kind of go, what do we want to keep? What do we view as being the problems of sustainability? And what do we see our role as an institution as being in relation to that, right? So you could say we have no role. You know, I think a lot of pension schemes at the moment are trying to grapple with climate change. Them going, well, we're passive investors. We know that if we do anything with members, and at the same time, we know that the market is being pushed by governments to reduce carbon dioxide. So a number of pension schemes will say, we have no role in relation to climate change. Right? And, you know, they're not wrong. They're really wrong if they don't air it. But that kind of logic flow is perfectly reasonable. So put it out there and allow people to try and come and take that down and say, no, actually, you do have a role. You have to finance green tech. You have to close the coal mines. You have to do. But that process of kind of putting it out there, going through that kind of sustainability strategy piece has to be, you know, kind of written up. And somewhere in there is a kind of time frame, right? So, you know, we wrote this in 2021, but we'll be reviewing this in 2022, 2031, you know, how long is your time frame thinking about sustainability, and how often are you going to challenge yourself on kind of what you do? So, yeah, there's what is sustainability? I think it's a governance process of looking at what is sustainable and recognizing that there is nothing which is kind of sustainable for all time. There is no thing that I can put a label on like I can a dog and expect dog things to always be dogs. There is not a sustainable thing which will always be sustainable. And that's because the value systems will change and the underlying systems will change. So sustainability is a governance process which is not continually, but routinely examining what is considered by an institution to be sustainable. And, you know, wrapping back in a lot of the complexity that I've just kind of shown you, right? Wrapping that back in to the kind of logic flow of the institution. And then I think really importantly, kind of communicating those results. So that is what I hope, you know, a kind of sustainability-led organization will be doing. And I think that's the point. I probably massively overspent my time there, didn't I? But that's the point. I'll kind of pause, and I think we'll have a conversation, Nick.
So one quick note on time. We now have about 25 minutes left. So Nick, I'll leave. I don't think we've lost too much time, but Nick, I'll leave it to you to discuss with Nico and then to bring to the floor.
Well, okay, I'll try and be brief, and thanks. That was really brilliant and interesting. And I think the main problem was it was the first lecture in a 100-lecture series on what is this. You're starting off like with the universe, the Big Bang, and the heat death of the universe, and that's fine. But I just wanted to say, actually, first of all, a few things I really liked about the talk before I slightly critique it, and we can have a discussion about that. First of all, I love the idea about the falsifiability and the sustainability as a governance process. This lack actually get to the critique of that the world isn't static from another place, which I might get into to you. But I was actually, in the majority of your talk, I was kind of reflecting though on you know, in the human thinking or thought disciplines, if you like, we split things up into kind of emergent and perceptions of emergent structures. And what I mean by that is we have something called biology and chemistry and psychology. And these are kind of emergent levels at which you view things, which give you, and you're not, so when you study chemistry, you're not necessarily studying quantum physics, although quantum physics actually is behind physics. Chemistry, if we talk about a field, say English literature, right, and you study a novel by Jane Austen, you can go back to relate it to psychology and biology, and then quantum physics, and then start your critique at the beginning of the Big Bang. But then there's also a English literature criticism of Jane Austen, and if you go back to the Big Bang, you're kind of losing a lot. There is knowledge in that, English literature. So I'm kind of slightly worried that when we're talking about affairs, about what we think of sustainability, if you relate this to thermodynamics, you can do, but too much emphasis, you might end up losing quite a lot. And so then it comes back to what is sustainable, and is this a thing in the universe, or is there something that we can define as sustainable using positive, is there a normative element? Is it always that we like sustainability, right? So and so if we then go to, let's think of another concept. Let's think about, is there meaning in the universe, right? Well, if we look at, there's no meaning in the universe, right? It's in physics, there's no meaning, there's no such thing. But there obviously is something that humans think of as being meaning, because I say the word meaning, it means something to you, right? It's a human creation. But this doesn't mean that it's not a valuable thing. It's not that we can't discuss what meaning means. Strong view people. So I think that sustainability is between these categories, but it's more like meaning. So I tried to attempt a sort of physical definition of sustainability, and I came up with something, along these lines, which I think most people agree with, which is sustainability is the ability of a system to keep its level of complexity without too much risk of it going to a low level of complexity, right? And that has physical elements, but it's also got normative elements. Risk means, think about complexity and say the level of complexity on Earth, like totally destroying nature and replacing it with all human computers and things might keep the level of complexity on Earth at the same level, but it's something that we would generally think of as being unsustainable. So I think within the idea of sustainability, or what is sustainable, there are normative elements. There are elements, also elements of aesthetics. We think nature is beautiful, the rainforest is beautiful. So chopping it down and replacing it with something equally complex will not, we think that's not actually sustainable. But just because this is my own aesthetic judgment doesn't make it wrong, right? That is kind of, I feel, what sustainability is. And then we go into so sustainability is something I think that humans create. So we've got to kind of then have some understanding of why humans think in the way, is it right, except so the Bruntman definition of sustainability, which is about human needs, so the ability of the future to provide needs of the present without prejudicing needs of the future. So that's entirely anthropocentric. That's only viewing nature as something useful because we need it, which is the opposite of the view that you gave of nature being sacrosanct and preserved and static, which is also wrong. And so I'm coming this is a long ramble and coming back to you of, you've defined what is sustainability, which I agree with, and I like this idea of falsifiability in a process, but what is sustainable? Because the process of sustainability actually relies on the definition of what is sustainable. So my view of what is sustainable is it actually has to be a mixture of this of a complex system, not reducing it to a lower level of complexity, but there's also an element of morality in there, or in what we believe is right, that it's, for example, wrong to destroy nature. And there's an element of aesthetics, as you implied about your elephant. And how do we, there's a process of falsifiability or sustainability, but then what's the actual sustainable bit at the end of that? Because it's a kind of some end, and you have to have a view of what that end is.
Thank you. One bit, I'm conscious that we should try and get comments from the floor as well. But So I think my main concern is that because nothing is at some stage when we call something sustainable, and so therefore, if you don't kind of bring along a bit of the baggage, then you risk essentially saying, hey guys, if we stop emitting carbon dioxide, then we're going to save the world, right? And then 5 years later, one generation later, we destroy the world anyway, right? And then what you've done is you've kind of broken the trust that anyone is going to have in anyone who says anything ever again, right? All you're doing is kind of forestalling the anarchy, right? And are you being more sustainable then? Well, no, because like part of the complexity that we'd like to keep is civilization, right? So if you have this sort of system where we deliberately lie with our knowledge to say, hey, this action is sustainable, and you don't kind of go like asterisks, then I fear that you lose them. You lose them at some point in the future. And, maybe I'm crediting the populace with too much thought and maybe, or too little, right? And, maybe everyone knows when we say sustainable that, hey, it's just a point in time assessment. And now we're talking about CO2 and soon we're going to be talking about plastic or what are they called? Forever chemicals or whatever other thing that we're doing. Or like, when we've got fusion, we're going to be worried about deuterium. And when we've got, Dyson spheres, we're going to be worried about the supply of stars, right? So hey, we always know that sustainability carries with it this big caveat. I don't know. But my suspicion is that we're very actively saying to everyone, this is a sustainable thing. And that means you can do an infinite amount of it. And you can't, right? And that conversation has not been had, I don't think. And that would be, I love everything that you loved about my talk, Nick. I loved everything you just said, but I still have that kind of fear. It's a fear. I think that's the right way to.
Oh, well, I'll have a comeback on that and then we go, because it's a question. I mean, I actually found a quote from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which said, like, space, it says, is big, really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-boggling big. I think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to space, right? And I think if you think about the time frame, if you think about the time frame of the life of the universe and that there's this heat death, right? But that's not how we live our lives, because we live our lives in the moment. And what there's a question of degree about, we need to do something now to make ourselves more sustainable, right? But then maybe in X amount of time, this itself will cause damage, and I entirely agree with you, and that will cause problems. But in that, are kind of likely to do the opposite. We're more likely to not take enough, do the immediate damage we're doing is far too much to then be concerned about and be aware that there's a constant process, but actually the error we tend to make is the far too short term rather than the not long enough term. That makes sense. I don't think that's very good. But Sam, would you like to open the floor out to questions?
Yes, we are limited on time. We've only got 15 minutes left, so I'm going to do this slightly differently than we would. Instead of opening to discussions, we don't have time to have deep discussions. And I think there are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 deep discussions based on everything we've heard and learned today. So what I would ask you to do, the discussion question or the discussion topic that you have in mind to the group, but we won't go into it. So I want to give people a chance to bring the top points, the high points, the things that are really valuable for so your observations, but to give people a chance. So if you've got something you want to say, either put your hand up visually, the icon, and I'll start with Suche.
Okay. I don't really see because if we start with the last slide, which Nico put forward about what is a sustainable attitude or practice for institutions, is a good place to start, and you can zoom out to very far out. But if I look at Peter Murphy's blog, I just checked on Peter Murphy's. You talk about you have a suspicion that that the current ESG thing is not sustainable in a deeper sense, but people will still go on about it. So that's fine. Tariq Fancy from BlackRock exposed the whole world. So there's a lot of multi-causes, right? But I think it's sustainable for, in our sense, from where we are for the next 30, 40 years. The profession might not be sustainable, right? Context has changed, right? But what we should we do use knowledge, and Popper has a theory of propensities. Yeah, it's not just possibility. So I think we need to create a narrative, a cascading narrative, which will change with time. But currently, some of the narratives we suspect are not robust enough. They are too driven by market mechanism, which still promote growth. Yeah, so that we got to debunk and debunk with to most people, but we don't have the complete answers yet. But a guide would be Kate Raworth's book, you know, how planet Earth is sustainable is another question, right? It is the most important question for us, whether the solar system or bigger pictures. I think there's a place for ecology and all that. So that will be my observation. But you see how complex it is, right? The complexity requires us to listen, you think. And I quite like Nick Silver's from Jane Austen, she goes to sustainability, yeah, which is a fair point, right? It depends on how we are trained, right? A religious person will enter this problem in a very different way. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Suchay. I'll try and limit you all to no more than 2 minutes. I only see 2 hands, so that should be fine. Rob Thompson.
So, in other words, hypothetical deductive science is irrelevant, and we must take the decision makers' subjectivity and uncertainty seriously in our advice to them. But maybe we can use a Bayesian approach to our prior distributions. Very well, that tells us about the past, and it's not based on hypothetical deductive thinking. Problem is, it might get towards it might take a long time to reach its limit. And what is its limit? So Bayesian thinking also has limits.
Thank you, Rob. Nick Spencer.
Oh, yes. So things I pick up from Nico's that did like was that, you know, we should think about sustainability being dynamic. If we want to think about anything, it needs to be time-based, so we need to think about a time frame. And it's also a process. You know, those need to be refreshed. It's how I think about a net zero portfolio. Net zero is not a metric today. It is a process that you measure over time. And likewise, in terms of being dynamic, we're looking at climate. I keep in sort of motion, we've got to talk about biodiversity and fairness. Do I think in that context we can define sustainability? Well, I'd say at the moment, aligning to support all the SDGs by 2030 could be what we, you know, the action to do that could be our current definition of definable. And actually you immediately see that it's broader based, but we're going to have to evolve that forward over time. I think the challenge in the medium term will be to look at something like, say, if you look at the diversity, we need to think about it in sense of the 3 capitals, but also I think there's a contradiction at the moment growth, but the way I read Descriptor is not only that we'd have to halve our GDP trajectory at the moment just to become, by 2030, just to become sustainable, that long-term sustainability is a human population of less than 2 billion rather than 9 billion. So in Nico's term, we're already at an unsustainable point. And actually the only way we have to reshape the whole of what we're doing if we want a Nicosian type millennial sustainability, let alone.
Thank you, Nick. Peter Murphy, and then after that, Peter.
I've really enjoyed Nick's slides, and I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I take from it is this idea of looking at timescales, and I think both the ideas of looking at things over a very long time scale, and that sort of automatically making you think about all the other different timescales that you can think over sustainability, and also the idea about it being easier to show what is not sustainable. And I think fashion is actually about communicating risks and communicating where those risks around sustainability exist, and also thinking about how we do that over different timescales for the institutions that we all work for. I think it is a really interesting place to be.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, your turn.
Cool. Thanks everyone for the talk. I think one thing that I found a lot of, effectively the decider or the investor, in terms of their worldviews, in terms of what they view as sustainable and what they don't view as sustainable. And I think soft systems methodology, sort of championed by Peter Checkland, plays quite in terms of either a company or board or the investor deciding by taking care of different worldviews and approaching it as a systemic inquiry at a time, and almost having that evolution of views of sustainability as things progress.
All right, thank you, Peter. There are no more hands up. Your hand. No. Oh, I saw it again.
Saying goodbye to my wife this morning.
Okay. Well then, that gives me about 5 minutes to wrap up, unless anybody has anything else pressing. I will give my thoughts. I have 3 pages of paper of thoughts, because I don't write very small. First, there's basically 3 points I want to make in terms of the talk. One is that I think people are very aware of greenwashing, but are also overjoyed to have usable data providers and services. The question is what falls among the cracks, and probably way too much. So the question is then, how do we deal with what falls between the cracks in an actionable manner, real world spheres and jobs and organizations and volunteer time? So what can we do individually and through our organizations? Secondly, an idea about failure. So risk, success, and failure I think are necessary, a necessary part of the world on a micro scale, people, small businesses, etc., but also on a macro scale. Risk, success, and failure still need to be a part of the system. How protectively or prudently plan or prohibit, and what does survival mean? And thirdly, that kind of inability, right? I'm not certain, but it just seems like it requires metrics, measurement, understanding, and then jurisdiction and enforceability. If we're going to have, perhaps by Nico's take on falsifiability and things which are demonstrably not sustainable, there has to be some ability to enforce, to prohibit things which are really, really bad. I think we have done that as humanity over time, but perhaps in the lag time has been too long. So those are my thoughts, and as a way to also say thank you, Nick. I think today was very successful in terms of helping us think differently. I think I jotted down 4 brilliant ideas, 2 of which I think I can actually use in my work, which is really exciting. So on the back of this, I would urge you to continue discussions that came up today. Groups, come up with ideas for future webinars, little cozy, familiar webinars like this, or bigger ones for FinSTIC profession. On the positive side, I think that we as a world are in the creative phase of problem solving. The sustainability police hasn't been founded yet. We're in a creative fact-finding, way-finding period of how do we solve this problem, and we're not limited. We're very free to find the best way. And with that, I think I'll. Nico or Nick, do you want to say anything before we close?
Just that the sustainability police sounds a terrifying prospect.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about the sustainability, maybe not police, but it's almost like planning permission, because I think it's the other way around, right? You demonstrate, it's like the precautionary principle. You should come along and demonstrate that what you're planning to do is unsustainable, as opposed to be caught for doing something. I think when you're at 9 billion people or 8 billion people on the planet, you know, you very quickly get away from you. So yeah, sustainability court maybe, or sustainability.
Well, police is the wrong word, but my basic idea was you have, before we became so global, countries, nations, and groups of people had sets of rules by which to live to ensure level of civilization, right? But we're at a point where we're global and we have these local rules, but we don't have these global rules of behavior. Mm-hmm. And so that there can be a police enforce the national laws, but there doesn't need to be a police, but there probably do need to be these rules. And I think that's what a lot of the processes, international processes you see doing, are trying to achieve with the power structures as they are. Which is
what though Nico would argue is that just the reflection is that the rules imply a fixed process. So rather than rules, it's more of a constant dialogue and process of governments for agreeing what is the current.
Which may be too cumbersome, right? So the rules are the shorthand of that process, and there may be enough things that you can agree on that you set rules. And indeed that those rules are not fixed forever, but you need issues with laws, so it's very hard to tear them up. So a process which can set and then remove rules is a success which just sets rules, could well be an issue, because you're going to start to accrete things which are no longer needed.
Yeah, I mean, COP every 4 or 5 years seems like too long. Yeah. But in the grand scheme of things, maybe it's not long enough, but you do need to set these things and review them.
Just to throw in the middle, aren't the SDGs, I mean, hugely flawed, but aren't they actually a concept that is similar to the one you're discussing, albeit that it have to be updated for globally agreed?
They are. It's part of a process of world government, United Nations, but United Nations is dysfunctional unless you have a shared narrative. Yeah, and the best times when the whole world worked together was after the Second World War, where a lot of the setup. So you need the politics and the world narrative, and always to take a war, a disruption, or a virus to get them together, or a financial crisis. But even then, it's not complete. So we are getting more frightening. So we need a few more disasters to shock the world, because you need a burning platform. And the burning platform is that if New York is burning in the same way, or Beijing is burning in the same way as Lake Tahoe or somewhere else, the impact might be a bit different, right? But currently we are still very fragmented, and of course, but survival is not guaranteed, but.
I'd also just point, I'm conscious people are probably going to start dripping away, and that's absolutely fine, right? So I'm really conscious that, what you can't have sustainability at every level determined by the top. So if I think for homes, the government wants more homes being built, and is really struggled to get any kind of local authority to build the right number of homes to meet that kind of top level target, because everyone at every local level goes, hey, I don't want those houses here, right? So what is sustainable? You know, we should keep our forests, but some forests are in the way, right? So every decision has to be made in the context of a global framework, but at a local level, and we're just not. We're not developed enough as a society. Right? So it's going to be very difficult.
No, I think you got to start. I'm working for the big emission agreements, right? But local frameworks, I mean, like say Amsterdam, right? They're doing a lot of things, and there are parts of England where they're building mini forests, and they're not big enough, right? So you can start something, maybe stop. Yeah, but they may not be big enough. But there are a lot of local initiatives bottom up, garden cities and all that, similar to garden cities. But we are still flying. but we still got. But our hope is very lucky now. You go to your investment first, it's still maximizing our share price. So because we live that way, so we need a fundamental shift in the view.
Well, at this, sorry, CJ. If you have, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. But,
no, please, I'm done.
I'm going to kick you all off now. It's time to go, and urge you again to continue conversations if you want, bilaterally or in a group. And if you really want, perhaps we can reconvene this group to discuss. But that's it for today.
Is that kicking us off the first action of the sustainability police?
Yes, exactly. I've been elected unilaterally by myself.
You can do a part 2 where everybody, if they want to speak, must be 2 slides, so they can speak in a more structured way.
Yes, if you do want that, then send an email, and we'll arrange that. Thank you.
In the alternate weekends. Okay. Okay. Bye bye.